What happened that stormy night would change everything. Sarah Martinez thought she knew about courage, but in those first quiet hours before the chaos began, she had no idea that nature was preparing to test every bond she had ever forged with the animals in her care. The remote Mountain Ridge Equestrian Center sat nestled in a valley where weather patterns collided with unusual intensity, but nothing in Sarah's 15 years of experience had prepared her for what was building in the darkening sky above. The first sign wasn't the wind or the distant rumble of thunder. It was the horses themselves. Sarah noticed it during her evening rounds, when the usually calm animals began moving with an agitation that seemed to pulse through the barn like electricity. Their ears swiveled constantly, their eyes wider than normal, cracking sounds and scents that only they could detect. The air itself felt different, charged with an energy that made the hair on her arms stand on end, despite the warmth of the late summer evening. Weather reports had been calling for severe thunderstorms all week, but the meteorologists seemed genuinely concerned about this particular system. The atmospheric conditions were creating what they described as a perfect storm scenario, with multiple weather fronts converging over the mountainous region in a way that hadn't been recorded in decades. The local emergency services had issued warnings about potential flooding, power outages, and dangerous lightning activity that could last throughout the night. Sarah moved through the barn with practiced efficiency, checking each stall and ensuring that water troughs were filled and feed bins secured. But her attention kept drifting to the horses' behavior. Even the oldest, most seasoned animals were showing signs of distress. Their restlessness wasn't random. It followed a pattern, as if they were responding to something approaching that human senses couldn't yet detect. The temperature began dropping rapidly as the sun disappeared behind increasingly dark clouds. What had been a clear evening sky transformed into something that looked almost supernatural, with layers of clouds moving in different directions and an odd greenish tint that photographers sometimes captured before tornadoes. The wind picked up in sudden gusts that rattled the barn doors and sent loose hay swirling through the air. By 9 o'clock, the first lightning appeared on the horizon, still distant but visible as brief illuminations against the heavy cloud cover. The thunder that followed came in long rolling waves that seemed to shake the ground beneath the barn. With each flash, the horses grew more agitated, and Sarah found herself checking and rechecking the security of their stalls. Among all the animals showing signs of distress, one stood apart in the intensity of his reaction. In the corner stall, a magnificent dark brown stallion named Midnight paced with an energy that bordered on frantic. His muscles trembled beneath his glossy coat, and his breathing came in short, sharp bursts that fogged in the increasingly cool air. Sarah had worked with Midnight for months, slowly building trust with the rescued horse, but tonight something deeper was stirring in him, something that spoke of memories and trauma that ran far beneath the surface of their carefully constructed relationship. The storm was coming, and with it, a test that would push both woman and horse beyond everything they thought they could endure. What Sarah discovered in Midnight's eyes that night revealed a darkness that no amount of gentle training could ever fully erase. Because some wounds carved by betrayal and abandonment run deeper than flesh and bone, embedding themselves in the very soul of a creature who had learned that storms meant being left behind. The magnificent dark brown stallion stood nearly 17 hands high, his coat the color of rich coffee beans, but beneath that powerful exterior lived a terror so profound that it transformed him from a noble animal into something wild and unpredictable whenever thunder rolled across the sky. Midnight's history had been pieced together slowly over the months since Sarah first encountered him at a livestock auction where unwanted horses were sold for pennies. The seller had been reluctant to share details, but eventually the story emerged like a confession pulled from a guilty conscience. 3 years earlier, during a violent thunderstorm that had spawned tornadoes across the county, Midnight's previous owner had simply opened his stall door and driven away, leaving the young stallion to face nature's fury alone in an empty barn with no shelter. no comfort, and no understanding of why the human he trusted had abandoned him in his moment of greatest need. The psychological damage from that night had created patterns of behavior that surfaced whenever atmospheric pressure dropped and electrical storms approached. While other horses might show normal signs of weather sensitivity, Midnight's response bordered on psychological breakdown. His breathing would become labored, his eyes would roll back showing white, and his powerful muscles would begin trembling, as if he were fighting an invisible enemy that only he could see. As the current storm intensified outside the Mountain Ridge facility, Midnight's terror began manifesting in ways that concerned Sarah deeply. He had begun weaving back and forth in his stall, a repetitive motion that horses developed when extreme stress overwhelmed their ability to cope. His hooves struck the stall walls with increasing force, creating hollow, booming sounds that echoed through the barn and agitated the other animals. Sweat darkened his coat despite the cooling temperature, and foam gathered at the corners of his mouth, where he had begun biting at the air. The other horses responded to Midnight's distress with their own mounting anxiety, creating a cascade effect that turned the normally peaceful barn into a powder keg of nervous energy. Horses are prey animals with finely tuned survival instincts, and when one member of the herd broadcasts terror, the others instinctively prepare for whatever danger might be approaching. The sound of shifting hooves, snorting breath, and creaking stall doors created a symphony of unease that grew louder with each flash of lightning. Sarah recognized the warning signs, building toward a breaking point. Midnight's eyes had taken on a glazed quality that spoke of a mind retreating into survival mode, where rational thought gave way to pure instinct. In that state, he became dangerous not through malice, but through the unpredictable actions of a creature reliving trauma. His strength could easily break through the stall door, and once free, a panicked horse weighing over 1,000 pounds became a threat to everything and everyone in his path. The storm outside continued building toward something unprecedented, but inside the barn, a different kind of tempest was brewing in the heart of a horse whose trust in humans had been shattered by abandonment, and whose terror was about to put everyone at risk. The moment that changed everything arrived not with a whisper, but with a crack that split the night like the world itself was breaking apart. And in that blinding instant, when heaven touched earth with violent electricity, Sarah understood that some forces of nature care nothing for human plans or the fragile bonds we build with the creatures we love. The lightning bolt struck the metal weather vane atop the barn with a sound that seemed to shatter reality itself, sending a cascade of sparks showering down like fallen stars, while the electrical surge raced through every wire and circuit in the facility. Darkness swallowed the barn whole as the power died, transforming the familiar space into something alien and terrifying. Emergency lighting flickered once and failed, leaving only the intermittent illumination of lightning flashes to reveal snapshots of chaos unfolding in slow motion. The horses, already on edge from the building storm, erupted into panic as their world disappeared into blackness punctuated by the deafening crash of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. In that confusion of darkness and terror, the sound Sarah had been dreading finally came. The splintering crack of wood as Midnight's stall door gave way under his desperate assault. His hooves struck the barrier again and again until the latch mechanism, weakened by his earlier battering, finally surrendered to his panic-driven strength. The crash of the door hitting the ground was lost in the symphony of chaos, but Sarah felt it in her bones like a death knell. Through the strobing light of the continuing storm, she caught glimpses of Midnight's flight toward freedom that had become a race toward destruction. His powerful form moved like a shadow made flesh, muscles bunching and releasing as he galloped through the barn's main corridor and burst through the partially open doors into the fury of the night. Rain struck his coat like bullets, but he seemed oblivious to everything except the primal need to escape the enclosed space that had become a prison of remembered terror. Sarah's heart stopped as she realized the direction of his flight. Midnight was heading directly toward Lookout Hill, the highest point on the property, where a single massive oak tree stood like a sentinel against the storm. In clear weather, it was a place of beauty where visitors often stopped to admire the valley spread below. Tonight, it was a death trap, the most dangerous location an animal could choose during an electrical storm. Lightning seeks the highest point, the path of least resistance from sky to ground. And Midnight, in his panic, was racing directly toward becoming that path. His dark coat would be invisible against the night sky until the moment electricity found him. And by then it would be too late. The tree that had weathered decades of storms was about to witness either a miracle or a tragedy, and Sarah knew with terrible clarity that she was the only person who could determine which it would be. The storm raged with increasing fury, each lightning strike illuminating Midnight's progress toward the hilltop in terrifying detail. Time was running out, measured now not in minutes but in heartbeats, in the seconds between lightning flashes, in the distance between a frightened horse and the deadly embrace of nature's most violent force. What happened next would test every bond they had built, every moment of trust they had shared, and every ounce of courage Sarah had never known she possessed. The choice that would define the rest of Sarah's life crystallized in that moment, when she realized that sometimes love demands we abandon every rule we've ever learned about staying safe, because watching someone you care about face their deepest terror alone is a betrayal that cuts deeper than any physical wound. Standing in the darkened barn with rain hammering the roof like artillery fire, she understood with devastating clarity that Midnight was racing toward death, not just from lightning, but from the kind of abandonment that had already broken him once before. Her phone had no signal, the landlines were dead, and the radio crackled with nothing but static punctuated by fragments of emergency broadcasts, warning people to stay indoors. The roads leading to the facility had become rivers, according to the last coherent weather report she'd heard, with emergency responders unable to reach outlying areas until the storm passed. Help wasn't coming, wouldn't come, couldn't come in time to matter. The isolation that usually made Mountain Ridge Equestrian Center feel like a peaceful sanctuary had transformed it into a prison where life and death decisions fell solely on her shoulders. Every piece of training she'd ever received screamed the same message: never go outside during an electrical storm, never approach a panicked horse in the dark, never risk human life for an animal, no matter how much you care about them. The liability manuals were crystal clear, the safety protocols unambiguous, the insurance policies explicit about what constituted reasonable versus reckless behavior. Logic demanded she secure the other horses, wait for the storm to pass, and hope that Midnight would somehow survive his panic-driven flight to the most dangerous spot on the property. But logic hadn't spent months earning the trust of a horse whose faith in humans had been shattered by betrayal. Logic hadn't witnessed the gradual healing of psychological wounds, the slow rebuilding of hope in eyes that had once reflected nothing but fear and abandonment. Logic didn't understand that some bonds transcend species, that some connections run deeper than survival instinct, that some moments demand we choose love over safety, even when the cost might be everything. Through the barn's rain-streaked windows, lightning illuminated Midnight's progress up the hillside in terrifying snapshots. Each flash revealed him closer to the ancient oak tree that crowned Lookout Hill, closer to becoming a target for the next bolt that reached down from the storm-torn sky. His powerful form moved with desperate purpose, driven by trauma that transformed the open pasture into a battlefield where past and present collided in deadly fusion. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for her rain jacket, knowing that putting it on meant crossing a line from which there might be no return. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like the atmospheric pressure that preceded tornadoes, heavy with the knowledge that she was about to risk everything on the slender hope that months of patient trust-building had created a connection strong enough to overcome primal terror. She thought of Midnight's eyes when he'd first arrived, broken and wild. How they'd gradually softened as she'd proven day after day that not all humans would abandon him in his moment of need. If she stayed safe in the barn while he faced his demons alone on that hilltop, she would become just another person who had failed him when it mattered most. The storm raged outside, but the real tempest was in her heart, where duty battled love, and love was winning. The moment Sarah stepped through those barn doors into the storm's embrace would teach her that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward when terror threatens to paralyze every muscle in your body. And as the wind hit her like a physical blow, and the rain turned her world into a chaos of water and darkness, she discovered that some journeys transform you with every step you take toward the impossible. The storm didn't just surround her, it seemed to evaluate her, testing her resolve with gusts that nearly knocked her sideways, and lightning that turned the familiar landscape into something alien and hostile. The rain struck her face like cold needles, each drop carrying the weight of the storm's fury as she pushed forward across the pasture that had become a treacherous maze of hidden dangers. What should have been solid ground beneath her boots had transformed into a slippery bog where every step threatened to send her tumbling into the darkness. The familiar fence lines and gates that usually guided her path had disappeared into the night, leaving only the intermittent lightning flashes to reveal glimpses of her surroundings in stark, terrifying detail. Her rain jacket, which had seemed substantial in the barn, felt paper-thin against the storm's assault. Water found every seam, every gap, streaming down her back and legs, until she felt as though she were walking through the storm, rather than just in it. The wind howled with a voice that seemed almost human, carrying sounds that might have been midnight's frightened calls, or might have been her own imagination, conjuring fears in the chaos around her. Each lightning flash illuminated the hillside ahead in frozen moments of clarity that revealed Midnight's progress toward the summit. His dark form moved like a shadow given substance, powerful muscles driving him forward, despite the treacherous footing and the increasing intensity of the electrical display above. The ancient oak tree loomed larger with each revelation, its massive trunk and spreading branches creating a silhouette against the storm clouds that looked less like shelter than like a monument waiting to mark a tragedy. Sarah's rational mind screamed a constant litany of reasons to turn back, cataloging every danger with ruthless precision. The lightning strikes were getting closer, the intervals between flash and thunder shortening with each passing moment. The flooded ground could hide sinkholes or debris that would trap her far from help. A panicked horse was unpredictable, dangerous, capable of inflicting fatal injuries even when not meaning harm. But beneath the voice of reason ran a deeper current of connection that had been months in the making. She remembered Midnight's eyes on the day she'd first approached his stall, how the fear in them had gradually given way to cautious hope. She recalled the first time he'd allowed her to brush his coat, the trembling in his muscles slowly easing as trust built between them, stroke by gentle stroke. Those memories became her compass through the storm, pointing her toward a hilltop where a frightened horse was reliving his worst nightmare. The wind tried to push her backward with each step, and the rain tried to blind her, and the lightning tried to terrify her into submission. But Sarah pressed forward through the tempest, her boots squelching through mud and standing water, her heart pounding in rhythm with the thunder that rolled across the valley like the voice of an angry god. She was no longer just crossing a pasture, she was crossing the space between fear and love, between safety and sacrifice, between the person she had been and the person this storm was demanding she become. What happened when Sarah finally crested that hill and found Midnight trembling beneath the ancient oak would prove that some connections transcend the chaos of the physical world, reaching into a space where souls recognize each other, regardless of species, and where trust becomes a force more powerful than nature's most violent displays. The magnificent stallion stood silhouetted against the storm-torn sky, his dark coat glistening with rain, his powerful frame shaking not just from cold, but from the terror that had driven him to this deadly refuge, where lightning sought the earth with increasing hunger. The moment Sarah's boots found purchase on the hilltop's rain-slicked grass, something shifted in the electromagnetic fury surrounding them. Midnight's ears, which had been pinned flat against his skull in primal fear, suddenly swiveled toward her approach. His wild eyes, reflecting each lightning flash like mirrors of panic, seemed to focus through the chaos and find something familiar in the storm-lashed darkness. Despite the howling wind that should have carried away all sound, despite the thunder that shook the ground beneath their feet, he heard her. Sarah moved with deliberate slowness, each step a careful negotiation between her desperate need to reach him and the knowledge that one wrong move could send him bolting deeper into danger. The rain had plastered her hair to her skull and turned her clothes into a second skin of cold fabric, but she felt none of it. Her entire being was focused on the trembling horse before her, on the invisible thread of connection that had been woven between them through months of patient trust building. As she drew closer, something extraordinary began to unfold in the heart of nature's tantrum. The wind that had been battering them with relentless fury seemed to quiet to a whisper around their small circle beneath the oak tree. The lightning continued to fork across the sky, but its harsh illumination softened somehow, as if acknowledging the sacred space that trust had carved out of chaos. Midnight's breathing, which had been coming in sharp, panicked bursts, began to slow and deepen. Sarah extended her hand with infinite patience, the same gesture she had made countless times in the safety of his stall, and watched as recognition flickered in his eyes, like a candle flame refusing to be extinguished by the storm. The months of gentle morning greetings, of quiet conversations while brushing his coat, of shared moments when words weren't necessary, because understanding flowed between them like water finding its level. All of it crystallized in this moment of profound connection. The stallion's muzzle, wet with rain and foam from his panicked flight, stretched toward her palm with the same tentative trust he had shown on the day he first allowed her touch. The contact was electric in a way that had nothing to do with the storm surrounding them. His trembling began to subside as her presence anchored him to something stronger than his terror, something that whispered promises of safety in a voice only he could hear. In that impossible moment, surrounded by nature's most violent display, Sarah and Midnight found themselves wrapped in an invisible sanctuary, built from understanding, patience, and the kind of love that asks nothing in return, except the chance to prove itself worthy of trust. The storm raged on around them, but within their small circle beneath the ancient oak, calm prevailed, and healing began to flow between two souls who had found each other in the darkness and refused to let go. What Sarah discovered during those harrowing minutes, descending the hillside, would forever change her understanding of partnership, because while the journey up had been driven by desperation and love, the journey down became a delicate dance of mutual trust, where each step required both human and horse to choose faith over fear, in a world that seemed determined to test the very limits of their bond. The storm had not spent its fury during their moment of connection beneath the oak tree. Instead, it had gathered strength like a living thing preparing for one final assault on their fragile alliance. The descent began with Midnight following her lead, his massive form moving with careful precision behind her as they navigated the treacherous slope that had become a river of mud and debris. Each lightning flash revealed new hazards, fallen branches, washouts where the rain had carved deep channels in the earth, patches of ground so saturated that they threatened to give way beneath their combined weight. Sarah felt the constant pressure of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders, knowing that one wrong decision could send them both tumbling into the darkness. The wind seemed to have developed a personal vendetta against their progress, hitting them from angles that defied meteorological logic and threatening to knock them off balance just when secure footing became most critical. Sarah's legs trembled with exhaustion and adrenaline, her muscles burning from the effort of maintaining stability on the slippery terrain while constantly monitoring Midnight's position behind her. The stallion's breathing had steadied, but she could feel his tension through the invisible connection that linked them. His trust in her leadership balanced against instincts that screamed warnings about every shadow and sound. The storm's electrical activity intensified as they moved through the open pasture, as if nature itself had decided to test whether their newfound partnership could withstand its most violent expressions. Lightning strikes came closer together now, the thunder following so quickly that the gap between flash and sound disappeared into one continuous assault on their senses. The air itself seemed to vibrate with electrical charge, making Sarah's skin crawl and causing Midnight's mane to lift and dance with static energy. Halfway across the flooded pasture, Sarah realized they were in a race against time, measured not in minutes but in heartbeats. The standing water was rising, turning familiar pathways into streams that tugged at their legs with surprising strength. What had been puddles during her desperate journey up the hill had become channels deep enough to trap an unwary step, and the rain showed no signs of diminishing its relentless assault. Midnight's hooves found purchase on the slick ground, with the sure-footed confidence of an animal whose survival had always depended on reading the subtle language of terrain and weather. His presence behind her became both comfort and responsibility, a reminder that her choices now affected not just her own safety, but the life of a creature who had placed his complete trust in her judgment. The barn's lights, when they finally appeared through the sheets of rain, looked like salvation itself. But Sarah knew that reaching safety would mark not an ending, but a beginning, because what they had discovered about trust and partnership in the heart of nature's fury would transform every moment they shared from this night forward. The storm had tested their bond and found it unbreakable, forged in lightning and sealed with the kind of courage that only emerges when love demands we risk everything for those who matter most. What Sarah learned in those first quiet moments after leading Midnight into the safety of the barn would reveal that some storms rage not in the sky but in the hidden chambers of memory, and that the night's terror had been less about lightning and more about two wounded souls finally finding the courage to face the darkness they had been carrying alone for far too long. As she secured the stall door and watched Midnight's breathing slowly return to normal, she noticed something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a clarity that spoke of barriers falling, of walls built from old pain finally beginning to crumble. The revelation came not in words, but in recognition. The way truth sometimes arrives like dawn, breaking gradually over familiar landscape, transforming everything while changing nothing at all. Sarah had always known that Midnight's terror ran deeper than simple weather sensitivity, but as she studied his posture in the aftermath of their shared ordeal, she began to understand that his storm phobia was merely the surface manifestation of something far more profound. His previous abandonment hadn't just created fear of thunder and lightning, it had taught him that the people he trusted most would desert him when he needed them most desperately. Standing there in the dim barn, with rain still drumming against the roof, Sarah felt her own carefully constructed defenses beginning to shift and settle like sediment disturbed by an earthquake. She had spent 3 years pouring herself into the rehabilitation of broken horses, telling herself it was about giving them second chances, about proving that patience and consistency could heal any wound. But watching Midnight's transformation throughout the night forced her to confront a truth she had been avoiding. Her own need for healing ran as deep as any animal she had ever tried to save. The parallel between their stories unfolded with the inexorable logic of water finding its level. Just as Midnight had been abandoned during his moment of greatest vulnerability, Sarah had experienced her own betrayal years earlier, when the people closest to her had disappeared during her darkest period of grief and loss. She had learned, as he had, that depending on others led to disappointment, that safety lay in self-reliance, that trust was a luxury neither of them could afford. Yet tonight had shattered those carefully maintained barriers for both of them. Sarah had risked everything to prove to Midnight that not all humans would abandon him in crisis. And in doing so, she had discovered her own capacity for the kind of selfless love she thought had died with her ability to trust. Midnight had followed her down that treacherous hillside, not because instinct told him to, but because something deeper than survival had whispered that this human was different, that this connection was worth believing in, despite every lesson his past had taught him. The barn felt different now, charged not with electrical energy, but with the quiet power of transformation taking root. Sarah reached out to touch Midnight's neck, and this time his response carried no trace of the old weariness. His trust had been tested in nature's crucible and emerged stronger, purified of the dross of old trauma. They had both stepped into that storm carrying the weight of abandonment and betrayal, but they had emerged carrying something far more precious. The knowledge that some bonds are strong enough to weather any tempest, and that healing often begins the moment we decide someone else's well-being matters more than our own safety. As the thunder gradually faded into the distance, Sarah understood that their journey together was just beginning, but now it would unfold from a foundation of proven trust rather than cautious hope. What emerged from that storm-torn night would prove that true heroism isn't measured in headlines or awards, but in the quiet moments when broken souls discover they have the power to heal each other. And in the weeks that followed, Sarah would learn that the real miracle wasn't surviving the lightning, but watching a traumatized horse finally make peace with the thunder that had haunted his dreams for years. The transformation didn't happen overnight like some fairy tale magic, but gradually, like dawn breaking over mountains, each new day bringing subtle shifts that accumulated into something profound and lasting. The first test came 3 weeks later, when another storm system moved through the valley, bringing with it the familiar symphony of wind and rain and electrical fury. Sarah found herself holding her breath as the first rumbles of thunder echoed across the hills, her eyes fixed on Midnight's stall, where he stood calm and alert, but no longer consumed by the terror that had once defined him. His ears swiveled toward the sound, acknowledging its presence, but his breathing remained steady, his muscles relaxed, his eyes clear and focused rather than wild with remembered panic. Word of Sarah's midnight rescue had spread through the equestrian community like ripples in still water, growing and changing with each telling, until the story took on a life of its own. Local newspapers picked up the tale, television reporters came calling, and suddenly Sarah found herself being described as a hero, her actions held up as an example of the extraordinary lengths people will go to for the animals they love. But the attention made her uncomfortable, not because she was modest about her actions, but because she knew the real story was more complex and beautiful than any headline could capture. The truth was that Sarah hadn't saved Midnight that night. She had been saved by him. His trust had called forth courage she didn't know she possessed. His need had awakened something in her that had been dormant since her own traumatic experiences had taught her that caring too deeply led only to heartbreak. In risking everything for him, she had discovered that the capacity for love doesn't diminish when tested by tragedy. It grows stronger, more resilient, more willing to take chances on connections that might transform both giver and receiver. Midnight became a different horse in the months that followed, not because his past had been erased, but because he had learned that some humans could be trusted even in the darkest moments. His confidence grew like spring grass, tentative at first but gaining strength with each passing day. Other horses began to respond to his changed energy, and even the most skittish rescues seemed to calm in his presence, as if they sensed he had survived something terrible and emerged whole on the other side. The barn itself felt different now, infused with a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. Sarah noticed it in the way animals approached her, in the trust that seemed to build more quickly between her and the horses she worked with, in the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing she had proven to herself that love was worth any risk, any sacrifice, any leap of faith into the unknown. As Sarah stood watching Midnight graze peacefully in the pasture, one evening, thunder rolling gently in the distance like a remembered song that no longer held any power to frighten, she understood that their story had become something larger than either of them. It had become proof that healing is possible, that trust can be rebuilt, that sometimes the most broken things become the most beautiful when they're put back together with love and patience, and the unwavering belief that every soul deserves a second chance. If this story of courage, trust, and second chances touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe for more incredible tales of the bonds between humans and horses. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.